What is something that you have right now that you could use to serve the Lord? Hey, everybody, this is Pastor Justin Walker with The Whole Truth, where we're going through the entire Bible. I'm on a mission to get as many people into God's Word and all the way through God's Word from Genesis to Revelation. And there's an easy way for you to follow along with that. If you like that idea, if you like the concept of going all the way through the Bible, reach down and hit that subscribe button or follow button, and you'll get a new video every weekday. You get a new video in the morning where we're going all the way through the Bible. We're in Exodus chapter 4, and Moses has been called by God. He tried to step up on his own. He was in the palace. He was raised by the Pharaoh's daughter. He was the prince, according to Josephus. Moses was in line for the throne. And Moses tried to stand up for his people, the Hebrew people who were enslaved in Egypt, but it didn't work. So for the past 40 years, Moses has been in the wilderness. He's been tending to the sheep under his father-in-law Jethro and with his wife Zipporah. It's been 40 years. This man is 80 years old. He saw the burning bush, and God has called him and said, "Go back to Egypt and deliver the people." Now, check this out. Exodus 4, verse 1. Then Moses answered and said, "But suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, 'The Lord has not appeared to you.'" Now, this seems reasonable in the first part of this. Moses is a little concerned. He says, "You're telling me to go back to them, but what if I go to them?" And remember, God, he said, who should I say sent me? And God said, "You tell them that I am sent you. I am who I am has sent you." Nothing could describe God. Well, now Moses is saying to that, what if they don't believe me? Like, you're telling me to go tell them this. What if I go? Remember, in Moses' mind, 40 years ago, I tried this, and it had some pretty devastating results in his mind. Now, I believe that the Lord was training him in that time, and we'll see the fruit of that in just a moment, because look, in verse 2, so the Lord said to him, "What is in your hand?" He said, "A rod." Now, just stop there for a moment. Have you ever really thought about that? As God says to Moses, "What is in your hand?" Can you imagine Moses? He's standing. I got my little clicker here. Can you imagine he's standing here? He goes, "A rod." I mean, it's pretty evident what's there. What's in your hand, Moses? And you know what? You know what Moses says? He says, "A rod." And God said, and he said in verse 3, "Cast it on the ground." So he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled from it. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Reach out your hand, take it by the tail." And then he reached out his hand and caught it, and it became a rod in his hand. Oh, I love this. There's so much packed here. Moses has this rod in his hand. God says, "Cast that rod to the ground." So Moses does. He throws it to the ground, and it becomes a serpent. Now, this is probably not a small rod. This is a shepherd's rod. It was a big rod. It's what Moses would have used to fend off animals like wolves that would come after the sheep. He fought with that rod. It was something that he had fought with, he had used, but by very definition, it's a stick. It's a big stick that he had. And he throws it to the ground, and it becomes a serpent. And then God says, "Now take it by the tail." And so Moses reached down, takes it by the tail, and it becomes a staff again. It becomes a rod again. This is going to be a sign for the people. Remember how this started. Moses says, "How are they going to know? What do I do if they don't believe me? How are they going to know you sent me?" And God said, "You throw that rod to the ground." What's in your hand? You've got this rod. Now, here's some pictures that I want you to just start to let paint in your mind. First of all, notice that God didn't tell Moses to go get something, to go somewhere, to do something. He said, "What is in your hand?" In other words, he didn't say, "Go out and get 10 sticks." He could have, and other times with prophets, maybe we could find scenarios where God has done something like that. But in this case, God looked at Moses and said, "What do you have right now?" Remember, Moses has been a shepherd, not even a shepherd for his own flock, for the past 40 years. And now God says, "What do you have? What's God been training you with?" Here's this rod. It's just a stick. Throw that stick down, and God does something miraculous with it, and it turns into a serpent. I want to use the example right now of this very video that you're watching. For years, I have had this idea of teaching all the way through the Bible. And I have tried in several different fashions to come up with ways to teach through the entire Bible. In church, I preach through an entire book of the Bible. And eventually, I will preach the entire Bible. That will happen. However, I'm finding that it's very difficult with an hour service on a Sunday morning and I get about 30 minutes of that for a sermon. It's pretty difficult to get all the way through the Bible. We spent 2 years in the book of Luke, going all the way through the book of Luke. And so then I thought, well, maybe I'll try on Wednesday nights, I'll try to get through, teach through the Bible. And I did. I started having book studies on Wednesday night, but that becomes very cumbersome to try to do a Sunday and a Wednesday, and then people miss Wednesday or they miss a Sunday. And so that became problematic. And so I wasn't really certain what to do. And I thought, well, maybe I'd try to have some sort of a small group or whatever. And all of this time that this is going on in the past 10 years that I wanted to teach through the entire Bible, I thought about writing a blog. I thought about writing it out in book form, like a commentary. And God kept working on me, and he kept working on me. And the whole time I was totally avoiding social media. I hated social media. I know, look at me now, but I'm telling you, I hated social media. No Facebook, I don't even know if Instagram was a thing, but like MySpace back in the day. And I just hated any of that. And God started convicting me that Jesus went where people are. And so God started convicting me with the fact that I should be where the people are. And there's millions of people on social media, and they need to hear the truth of the gospel too. And so it started with that. And then I kept hee-hawing around about this idea of what should I do about teaching through the Bible. And my wife, she said to me very wisely, as always, she said, just do it. Use what you have. And I was like, well, I don't have a camera. I don't have equipment. I don't have this. And she said, you have a cell phone. You've got everything you need right there in your pocket. And right now, what you're watching is being videoed on a cell phone sitting on a rig that I've made up that sits in front of me. And I'm telling you, what God did was say, use what you have. You've got something right here. Use what you have. What do you have right now? You might say, well, I don't have a bunch of money. I can't start something. Well, you don't need a bunch of money. Well, I don't have a studio set up in my house like what you've got, Justin. Well, you don't need that. What do you have? And God can do something miraculous with it. Now, something else I want to point out. The fact that the staff turned into a snake. Why would God, of all things, why would it turn into a snake? I mean, he could have thrown that staff to the ground and it could have split the earth open and split the palace directly in two. It's not what happened. God could have turned that staff into dynamite, and he could have blown up a rock face with it. Moses could have thrown the staff and it could have stood up straight on its end, and no one else could have mimicked that. Earlier this year, everybody was standing up brooms on their end. What if that was what Moses had? Was he threw his staff and it just stood up on its end upright? Nobody else could mimic that. Do you understand what I'm saying? There are other things that could have happened besides a serpent. Why would God have the staff turn into a serpent? Well, I think that's purposeful. It's not the fact that the staff just turns into the serpent, but that God says, reach out and take that serpent, and then it turns back into a staff. All throughout the scriptures, serpents represent evil. I mean, we have in the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the serpent came. And later on in the Bible, we'll see in the Revelation, that old serpent, that is the devil. And so we see that serpents regularly represent evil. And we'll see this come up again later with Moses, as he has to make a staff that's got a serpent on it, a brazen serpent, so that everybody can be healed. Why would God use the symbol of a serpent when Moses throws the staff down? Well, I believe it's not just the fact that he threw it down, but that he had to take it up and that it didn't harm him. Most experts would tell you that grabbing a snake by the tail is probably the most dangerous part to grab it from, because that snake has its entire body to whip around and to grab you and to bite you from the other side. When you grab it by the tail, most experts who try to catch a snake will try to use something and pin it down and grab it behind its head so that they have control of its head and it can't whip around and bite them. But Moses was told specifically, grab it by the tail. And Moses did, and it became a staff again. It became a rod again. And I'm reminded of this, that God tells us that the gates of hell shall not prevail. You remember that? When God tells us that the gates of hell should not prevail against us, should not prevail against the church. And you and I make up the church. It's not a building. And so Moses reached down and grabbed that staff, and the staff had to obey. The serpent became a staff again. And I believe in the same way that God will use you and I in mighty ways, and the gates of hell cannot prevail. But we have to be obedient to what God says. Use what you have, and know that what you have, if God is in it and if he is using it, the gates of hell cannot prevail. How about that? We can attack the gates of hell and they can't prevail against us. So Moses reaches down and grabs that staff, and it becomes, or that serpent rather, and it becomes a staff again. Do you see the picture that God's painting? What do you have? Well, in case you think it's magic in the staff, let's read a little further into the story. Look at this. So this is in verse 5. That they may believe. Well, he reached out his hand, he caught it by the rod. Ending verse 4 there, and it became a rod in his hand in verse 5. That they may believe that the Lord God of their fathers, the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Furthermore, the Lord said to him, now put your hand in your bosom. And he put his hand into his bosom. And when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. And he said, put your hand in your bosom again. And so he put his hand in his bosom again, and he drew it out of his bosom. And behold, it was restored like his other flesh. And then it will be, if they do not believe you, nor heed the message of the first sign, that they may believe the message of the latter sign. And it shall be, if they do not believe even these two signs, or listen to your voice, that you shall take water from the river, pour it on dry land, and the water which you take from the river will become blood on the dry land. Wow. If you don't have a staff, he says, if they don't believe the staff, then do this. Take your hand and stick your hand into your bosom. In other words, like pull out your tunic, your robe, stick your hand in, and when he pulls it back out, his hand is leprous. And then he says, now put it back and pull it back out, and it's restored. Didn't even need a staff, because this had nothing to do with the staff. That staff will later be called the rod of God later in the text as we get through the Bible. That rod is pretty important. Moses holds that rod up, and the waters will split and the people will pass through on dry land. Moses will hold that rod up, and the Hebrew people will win battles as long as Moses is holding that rod up. But understand, it is never about the rod. It's about what God is doing with it. And that's what God is showing with this leprous hand. And if they won't believe the rod, then just use your hand. Listen, Moses, you have been called by God. Now he needs you to follow. Now check this out in verse 10. Look at what Moses says. Then Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." And the Lord said to him, "Who's made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, or the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be your mouth and teach you whatever you shall say." But he said, "Oh, my Lord, please send by the hand of whomever else you may send." And so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "Is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well, and look, he is also coming out to meet you. And when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. Now you shall speak to him and put words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I will teach you what you shall do. And so he shall be your spokesman to the people, and he himself shall be as a mouth for you, and you shall be to him as God. And you shall take this rod in your hand, with which you shall do the signs." Now, do you see what Moses just did? God gave him the sign, the rod, and then his hand, and then Moses says, "I'm not good at speaking." And God says, "Who made the mouth? Who's even formed man's mouth?" God is in control here. And Moses says this, he says, "Send anybody else but me." And God says, "Your brother Aaron, take Aaron with you. Your brother the Levite, take him with you. And I'll use him and I'll speak through him." And so from this point forward, now Moses is going to speak to Aaron, and Aaron is going to speak because Aaron is better at speaking. So Moses had some sort of a speech impediment, and he had that he was using that as a crutch, and he was fearful that maybe that was the problem and that the people wouldn't listen to him because he was slow of speech. And friends, I want you to think about this. What was God willing to do if Moses had been obedient and just went? God would have worked directly through Moses. Friends, listen to this. God does not need you to be perfect at talking. Look at my videos. How many times do I mess up? How many times do I mistype something in the titles and you have to tell me? God will use you if you're willing to be used. You say, well, I don't read good. Well, that's okay. God can use that. Well, I don't speak good. Well, God can use that. You might say, well, I'm not trained. God can use that. Friends, God can use whatever you have if you're willing to give it to him. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I will see you tomorrow with more of Exodus chapter 4. I'll see you then.